here. Now, a little background on these tanks. These tanks are World War II era tanks, severely outdated, and yet the U.S. continues to produce it. So what we're going to do is we're going to slash the budget by 40% in order to, and use that to put it into the park services. So this will be fiated immediately, put in place as soon as possible, and worked on through normal means. Now, if there's any questions about the framework, I urge the opposition team to stand up and ask now. With that, let's move on. So
Specifically regarding these M1 tanks, what kind of military technology do we have right now to replace these?
So there's multiple kinds of tanks out there. Now the M1 tanks are World War II era tanks. And in the tank industry alone, we've made significant technological advancements. And also these tanks are generally just not needed anymore because tank warfare in today's society is not a prevalent type of warfare. So now that I've answered that question, let's move on to advantages. Our first advantage today is tagline safety. So the 8 point here is that the current ranger system is very spread out and inefficient. So an example of this is if you look at the California Pacific Coast Trail, the PCT, each ranger station is spaced out 50 miles apart. If you look at the Whitney Trail, which is very popular for California goers because it's the longest or the tallest mountain in California and the continental 48, each ranger station is spaced 20 miles apart. So our 8.2 point here is that the response time of these rangers is very, very slow, which is horrendous for the safety of the people, which is our 8.3 point. It's very dangerous for the participants because response time is just so slow. So our B point here is that the plan allocates more money to the National Park Services. Now, according to the NPS site itself, when they requested money earlier this year, one of the specific things they wanted money for was to increase their emergency responses. So this is essentially just a warning that NPS is going to, in fact, increase its emergency response time. So our C2 point here is that we also need maintenance because erosion is a big problem on these trails. So our D point here is that essentially, by doing so, we're going to increase the safety for people, increase the safety of the participants, and make sure there's not people dying in national park. Now, I have a lot to get through, so I'm going to get through all these points, and then I'll take your question even if it's protected time. So with that, let's move on to our second contention of recreation. So our 8 point here is that America has been more and more focused on technology in recent years. So our 8.2 point is here. This has led to a decline, the first decline in national parks attendance in the history of America. Now, this decline has started in 1999 and it has been going slower since. And so our B point here is that the plan increases the money that the National Park Services has. Now, the same National Park Service site has also stated as a purpose that they want to modernize national parks. They want to use this to increase the attraction of this for the general public. So our C point is that the plan results in these parks modernizing. Essentially what they're doing is they're creating apps for each national park, which gives a historical background and a more almost entertaining aspect to the national parks. So our D point here is that there's more incentive for people to attend the national parks. Now this does a couple of things. The first thing it does is it increases the general health of the population because they're away from cities, they're away from pollution, and they're out breathing fresh air and getting exercise. And this is important because obesity is a huge problem in the United States right now. Now the second thing that this does is because it increases attendance, the funds that come into the government because of these national park admittance fees are going to be increased, which is more money comes into the government. So with those impacts, let's move on to the third advantage of today's plan. The third advantage is one titled jobs. So in the 2013 budget, there has been a 5% cut in the National Park Services. Now that 5% cut has resulted in massive layoffs for rangers. In fact, 60% of ranger programs are cut out and 40% of rangers have been laid off. That means they've lost their jobs. So our B point here is that we're increasing the amount of money in the NPS program. We're specifically increasing it by 13%. So going back to the idea of emergency services, our warrant here is that because they're going to invest in emergency services, they're going to increase the number of rangers hired just simply to keep people safe and keep them keep an emergency response team on lock. So this means the impact of this is there's more jobs, there's more ranger jobs out there. So not only are we going to recoup for the 40% of rangers that have been laid off by these budget cuts, but we're also going to employ even more because the increase that we're doing is 13% of the current NPS budget. So now let's move on to the fourth and final contention of today's round, entitled biodiversity. So our 8 point is here that national parks are essential to the conservation of animal plus plant species native to our country. Our 2 point is that some examples of endangered species right now are grizzlies, manatees, sea otters, and our America's very own bald eagle. Now these are threatened right now, and by cutting the budget, we've made these habitats, we've made the safety of these animals much less efficient. So our B point is here, we put more money into the system. Our C point here is that this results in more manpower and just more money for the protection of these essential habitats, these endangered species. We keep these species from going extinct. So our D point here is that we prevent the valuable species from dying out. We preserve what it means to be in America, the specific American animals. So with that, I urge a strong vote for the government side on this ballot. Thank you.
Is your name Rohan or Mayank?
I am Mayank.
Could you please tell us your name?
My name is Rohan Grover, first speaker of all.
Oh, 1 second, please.
Yeah. Ready? Let's begin. Going back to the resolution today, the United States federal government should significantly increase funding for national parks. As leader of opposition, I'll be going over the definitions and framework proposed by the government team. I'll be addressing their plan and their 4 advantages, and then I'll be providing an opposition team case. So since the opposition team doesn't have anything to dispute regarding the definitions and framework proposed by the government team, let's hop right into their plan. Now, going to the specifics of their context, they claim they want to increase the budget for the National Park Service by $400 million per year. Let's keep in mind, given the context of the resolution today, being significantly increased, it's important to note that this number that they're trying to provide has to be significant enough to make this definition. When we take a look at the overall scope of the National Park Service itself, the budget is $2.9 billion. $400 million isn't much more than a drop in the bucket for the National Park Service. But collectively, the Department of Interior, which manages the National Park Service and many other industries, that entire budget is $20 billion. $400 million for this ambitious plan is simply not enough to cover all the operations they want to, and I'll continue to elaborate on this as I go through their case. Furthermore, they claim that they're only going to be focusing on emergency response, specifically for park rangers to be able to respond to emergency situations, and so this will somehow improve the safety of the people overall. So let's keep this in mind as we go through the rest of their case and analyze their faulty links between biodiversity and emergency response from rangers. Before moving on, I will take the government team's first question.
Are you aware that in our plan we didn't specifically allocate these funds to emergency response, but rather to the entire National Park Service to do with them as it sees fit, among which of its goals are emergency response?
Sure, if that is true and you want to spread this $400 million even more thinly, this will even further de-incentivize the efficiency of the entire Park Service. Let's keep in mind the scope of the service right now and what it does. To put into perspective, let's take this round into perspective just 1 month back when the government shutdown took place. Essentially, a great example of what happened to the National Park Service is during the government shutdown for the Grand Canyon alone, it cost $1.2 million to run in just 7 days. Now, keeping this in mind, there are 59 national parks. The Grand Canyon is part of a larger national park, and on a yearly basis, it's impossible to run anything which is measly $400 million. It's clear that if they want to spread so thin their significant amount of funding across emergency services, across preserving biodiversity, and across preserving the wildlife overall for these national parks, it's simply going to be throwing money at a problem with no solvency simply because it's not going to be significant enough to do anything. Furthermore, if we take a look at the political situation inside the United States federal government, if we keep in mind that the Republicans were daring enough to cause the government shutdown, allowing the National Park Service to completely collapse, There's no reason to believe that they won't do so again. They will not approve such a plan in the first place, and they're not going to want to increase funding for the national parks. Now, the government team can come up here and claim fiat for this argument, but realistically speaking, in the current situation of the United States, with all these other pressing issues, budget allocation from wasteful military spending to the National Park Service is simply not a national priority, and there are plenty of more ways to stimulate the American economy and preserve the societal welfare of the American people. Furthermore, if we examine their solvency, they claim multiple impacts. They say they'll be able to allocate money to multiple aspects with the increased emergency maintenance. I'd like to point out that in the current budget of the National Park Service, it's been enough in order to cover all the obligations that the government team is talking about. The responsive services, as I mentioned, are covered in the annual revenue that the National Park Service generates in $27.4 million. So simply this extra money isn't actually going to be doing anything more than what we see in the National Park Service today, since I have a lot to get through maybe at the end. Furthermore, because they already have this $27.41 million revenue to cover all these issues, bypassing the government team's plan and adding $400 million, trying to spread so thin this type of money in order to generate the revenue to address these issues isn't going to be enough to cause any significant impact once they fill up their budget. Furthermore, if we take a look at the government team's first contention, they talk about how they will be increasing the general health, and their second contention, they talk about modernization. I'll be lumping these two together and saying that simply this amount of money is not well spent being the National Park Service, and if the United States federal government wants to generate more jobs for the American people, there are other sectors such as the Department of Energy and more stimulating economic sectors in the United States federal government to generate these jobs, to improve economic productivity, and perhaps an investment in the department, in some energy-related department, will be able to improve health concerns for the American people, not through the National Park Service, as that is not part of their jurisdiction. Furthermore, in the third contention, they talk about jobs, and they talk about how they'll be employing more ranger jobs. But the progressive nature of the United States federal government is not to reduce the unemployment rate by filling them completely with rangers, but rather we want to increase the job market and expand to other industries to improve economic productivity. The GDP isn't going to get any bigger by having a lot more park rangers, rather by having more productive citizens in higher industries, high-tech industries that will be able to generate job growth, promote the private industry, and indirectly raising consumer spending and improving the GDP overall. The park rangers is a minuscule amount of jobs that they'll be able to generate that are only temporary, only for maintenance, not expanding the American economy at all, so this is not a priority for the national government. Furthermore, their fourth contention about biodiversity, they claim something along the lines of we need to protect the grizzlies and bald eagles currently, but like I stated before, the emergency response system inside the National Park Service, even after all the budget has already been allocated and they already have this $27.4 million access, is enough to cover all of the prolonging costs and will not be directly affecting biodiversity, as there are other factors that do so, such as global warming, that are more prevalent. Now, going into the opposition team's case, I'd like to bring your attention to our first contention regarding opportunity costs, and that we could be spending this money in other places. I touched upon this briefly when I was covering the government team's case, but it's one of the strongest points of the opposition team's side, saying that the problem that they're trying to solve for simply doesn't exist. The National Park Service already has enough money to cover all these maintenance issues and emergency responses, and all the job growth and stimulation that they're trying to do is better spent in other departments of the United States federal government to generate more benefits, earning the opposition team 4 points in their favor. Furthermore, our second contention regarding effectiveness, by spreading this $400 million thin across the $2.9 billion budget is simply not going to be doing anything, simply because there are so many obligations that the National Park Service has, and $400 million is a drop in the bucket, as we pointed out with our Grand Canyon empiric example. And because of all these reasons, I strongly urge an opposition team vote.
Are the judges ready? Are my opponents ready? Yes. Is my partner ready? Yes. Okay, in that case, let's begin. What I'm doing in the speech is first going over basically the case that my partner and I presented, refuting the rebuttals made by the opposition side, and then going over the two disadvantages that they presented themselves. So let's take a look at this case. Now, their first issue was with our plan. Judges, what they said was that the money allocated to national parks is not significant enough. However, judges, let's take a look at this realistically. Now, when there were 5% cuts made to the National Park Service's budget, this resulted in 40% of rangers getting laid off. Now, what we're doing is we're increasing the current budget by 15%. So, Judge, if you don't believe that there's going to be a significant economic benefit from increasing this, if we won't be able to, pay for these jobs to come back, our opponents are simply not making the right case here. Furthermore, if they're trying to take out our plan with this, you have to realize that there has to be a bright line between what's significant and what's not. Our opponents don't come up here and define a certain percentage as significant. We're increasing the budget by 15% from $3 billion to $3.5 billion. There has to be a bright line somewhere, and we feel that that meets the definition of significant. Now let's move on down the flow. Basically, all of their refutations actually to our case are based off of this economic idea. They talk about how with regards to the Grand Canyon costs $1.7 million per weekend. $400 million is too little to do anything in a year. However, Judge, what we're doing is we're increasing the current funds by $400 million. $400 million isn't going to be the only thing that's funding these parks. We're increasing it from $3 billion or so to $3.4 billion. So as you can see, there's going to be significant economic impact from this, and furthermore impacts to biodiversity, recreation, etc. Now let's take a look at some of our opponents' other responses. They talked about how the regarding the M1 tanks, I'd like to point out that the M1 tanks have been deemed completely irrelevant spending by the House Appropriations Committee. They just haven't been slashed completely, so that's the thing that we're doing right now with our plan. Moving on to the idea of safety. Now, our opponents contend that this amount of money is not well spent here because it's spread out too thin to have a significant impact realistically. However, judges, if you take a look, spending this $400 million and increasing it by 15%, the same argument I made earlier applies. Furthermore, our opponents dropped everything else on that statement. So so they accept that we have a spread out ranger system, and they accept that if we have more rangers, that'll be able to fix it. So even if there's just one more ranger out there, we'll be able to save at least one more life by having ranger stations less spread apart. So as you can see, Judge, there's going to be significant examples for this. And if you want some examples of how the economic cuts specifically have damaged safety, for example, in Hawaii, due to the cuts, there have been not enough park rangers to provide maintenance to a particular trail, and it's been suffering significant amounts of water damage to the point that it is now unsafe for people to go on. So not only can those people miss out on this opportunity to go on these trails, but those who do are putting themselves at significant risk. And now I really do have a lot to get through, but again, same as before, we will get your questions if we have time. So now, looking at the second advantage, our opponent stated that that this is not the best way to allocate our money, and that we can have more improvement of health with creating energy jobs. However, judges, let's take a look about this. What happens when you create energy jobs? People are going to be sitting at their desks working. Those people aren't going to get as much recreation. Whereas if we have national parks, the people who do have energy jobs are going to be able to come and go to the national parks and improve their own lifestyle. Furthermore, energy jobs require a significant amount of significantly different skill set and a different amount of education. So that's not something that everyone can just have a high-tech energy job. We're creating jobs for those people who have the skill set of park rangers and that interest, which is a significantly impacted field right now. Now moving on to the third advantage, we talked about, again, jobs, and our opponents stated that there were better ways to get jobs and that park rangers have no effect on the GDP. However, judges, being a ranger requires a specific skill set, and it requires extensive training for those people to become rangers. By slashing ranger programs, we're essentially preventing those people from having jobs. For example, those 40% who were laid off, those people can now actually get their jobs back in addition to more job creation because of the economic impact. Furthermore, rangers do have a significant benefit to our country. After all, park rangers are responsible for the majority of environmental education. When students and children go on field trips or visits to these parks, they're able to expose themselves to the environment and therefore become better educated regarding environmental sciences, etc. So to state that park rangers have no impact whatsoever is completely ridiculous. So moving on to biodiversity, our opponents, again, the only statement was that these funds would be spread too thinly. However, there's been an impact in these programs just because of the 5% cut. Putting a 15% increase is going to be able to solve these issues and create more benefits. So we are going to be able to access all of our impacts because basically our opponent's only response was that it wouldn't be there. So now let's move on to the negations case itself. Their first disadvantage was that of opportunity cost. They stated that the problem doesn't exist. Now, judges, let's take a look. If the problem doesn't exist, why have 60% of ranger programs been slashed? Why have 40% of rangers across the country been laid off? To state that the problem doesn't exist is frankly insulting to those 40% of people who have lost their jobs because of these cuts. Now, furthermore, with regard to them stating that this would be too spread out, again, we've made the response to this numerous times, and I urge you to take a look at that. Now, with regard to their second disadvantage, actually their second disadvantage was the one of spreading these funds too thin. However, that's not something that's going to happen if you're increasing it by 15%. So judge, again, you have to look, judges, you have to look at the facts of the, you have to look at the numbers when you're making your decision about whether or not we're actually going to be having a significant impact. Now I'll take your question. Okay.
Regarding the American economy, what do we need more? Field trip guides or a high-tech industry to spur economic growth and improve the quality of life for Americans in this sense, rather than giving them trails for leisure?
I think my opponents misunderstand the point that I was making, first of all, about having skill sets. Okay, judges, these people who have specific ranger-oriented skill sets, who now no longer have jobs, those people are going to be having jobs. Now, our opponents contend that one job is more important than the other. However, a job lost is equally important, and a job that can be regained and have people funneling money into the economy because they now have a job which they can spend money with, etc. Once they have, and once they're giving education benefits to everybody else, that's going to be a significant benefit to our economy. So clearly we can see that there's going to be a huge amount of positive detriment. There's going to be a huge amount of positive impacts if we do implement this plan, which is why we strongly urge an affirmation ballot on today's resolution. Thank you.
Now, let's go back to the resolution. The United States federal government to significantly increase funding to national parks. As a second speaker for the opposition team, I'll be first recovering the government team's plan and their advantages before moving on to cover my partner's disadvantages to the specific plans they offer. And so first, let's go over the issue of the plan. Now, the primary issue that the opposition team had with the government team's plan here today is the idea that it's not enough significant spending. Now, they say there's no way to clearly define significant, but what we have to understand here today is that the only way we can measure as to why it's significant or how it's significant is what kind of impact it's actually going to have on these national parks or the National Park Service. Now, they talk about a lot of grand things in their plan. They talk about how they're going to decrease obesity, increase biodiversity, make sure there's more safety, and make sure that parks start to modernize. They plan to do a lot of things with this $400 million. But as my partner clearly pointed out in his speech, the problem here is that it costs quite a bit to run national parks, and simply $400 million a year is not going to cut it, especially because it's simply not going to have a large impact on the kind of processes and regulations that national parks currently go through. In my partner's speech, he mentioned that it currently costs about $1.2 million to run the Grand Canyon Park for 7 days. I did a little bit of math, and if we use $400 million instead, for all the national parks, it's going to last about 1 day. All of the $400 million would fund the entire program for the national parks for 1 day. Now, I know they mentioned that, no, we're not changing, we're not only making the budget $400 million, they're adding on $400 million. But the point is that the scope of the National Park Service, the point of this example is to show that the scope is very wide and very large. There are 56 national parks in the United States, and only $400 billion for every single one of these parks spread out completely. We have to question whether it's actually going to be effective. Now, however, they say that there's a lot of harms here. They explain that there's a big problem. They say the 5% cuts inside of the programs have created 40% of these park rangers being laid off, and they also said later that 60% of the programs in the National Park Service were cut. But let's look at these figures a little bit more closely. According to them, and according to the budget sequestration, the National Park Service budget was cut by 5%. 5% cuts somehow equated to 40% of the park rangers being cut. Now, if we do the math, 5% does not equal 40%, so it's a little bit questionable as to where they're getting their sources here, because it's highly unlikely that a 5% cut would reduce the park ranger's service by almost half. That simply sounds ridiculous, and unfortunately, we're not going to take it as fact because the math simply doesn't add up. But again and again, they constantly argue that somehow this 15% figure increase in the park ranger service budget will have this gigantic impact. But unfortunately, if we go point by point, that's not necessarily true. Now they argue here that safety is important and that somehow by increasing the amount of park rangers, we dramatically increase the safety. Now sure, this may be true if the park rangers have been decreased by 40%, but again we need to realize that that's not necessarily true. A more believable figure would be maybe park rangers have been decreased by 5%. But somehow that 40% of park rangers were cut off just because of this small cut is simply not necessarily the case. The second point they talk about is specifically about jobs. And they argue here that because so many rangers have been cut, we're going to see a lot more jobs increasing because we're going to be increasing the budget. But again, we need to realize that this is going to be spread over 56 different parks. There's going to be money needed to increase the biodiversity and increase the safety and modernize the park, all the things they talk about. And after that's all over, there's going to be a very small amount of money to run or hire, if any, new rangers at all. Sure, I'll take your question.
So are you aware that when we brought up the 40% statistic, we cited it specifically from the NPS website itself?
Okay, sure, you can say you cited it from there, that's fine, but just look at the figures. If the National Park Service in this budget was cut by 5%, is it really believable that 40% of the entire park ranger service was cut off? I'm not saying that they're false, but it's a little bit questionable as to whether that's actually true. I'm not sure if these figures are skewed or the website is wrong, but the fact here is that it's very unlikely that almost half the team of park ranger service that's needed to run the parks has suddenly disappeared just because of a tiny 5% cut. And so now that we've established that, let's finally move on to their last contention of biodiversity. Now here they somehow argue that by making sure we maintain our park service by increasing by $400 million, we're somehow going to save the bald eagle and save the grizzly bear. The problem here is that by increasing the budget of national parks, we're not increasing the scope of national parks. They're not building any new national parks. The same amount of protected land that we have right now for these endangered animals are going to stay the same. What happens to these endangered animals are already under the protection of national parks and isn't going to change just because you have one more park ranger in each park. The primary problem with endangered animals is not because we don't have enough national parks. It's with various other issues such as climate change, like my partner mentioned. And unfortunately, they're not really going to be impacting biodiversity in that stage. And now that we've covered the government team's case, let's move on to the opposition team's side and cover the two disadvantages my partner brought up. The first argument my partner brought up was about cost or opportunity cost. The question we need to ask ourselves is, are we using the money to its maximum potential? As we all probably know, the United States federal government is very wasteful for its spending, and unfortunately, as actors for the government, we need to make sure that the government is spending the money in the right places. Actually, a lot to get through, so I can't give your question right now. But unfortunately, that's not the issue. The very reason why the Park Service was actually cut by 5% originally is because the United States Congress agreed on a unilateral basis that it was a non-essential program. Essentially, they already have that money, and in fact, they can even take the 5% hit. The problem here is that there are much more pressing economic issues in the United States that the United States federal government and Congress must address immediately. And unfortunately, whether our national parks have one more ranger or not is not one of our primary issues right now as the United States federal government. Now, the second disadvantage of the opposition team was about effectiveness. Again, we need to reanalyze whether $400 million is going to be effective in making sure that all these national park services access the tremendous amount of benefits the government tries to claim. They argue that not only is it going to modernize parks, increase jobs, increase biodiversity, decrease obesity, and make people start enjoying scenery more, they have a lot of obligations here, and unfortunately, all of these obligations I've proven to you here today are not going to be effective. This further proves the point that as the United States federal government, we need to be careful where we're spending our money, and unfortunately, throwing $400 million at the National Park Service is not going to be an effective way to make sure that our natural parks and our national parks are managed correctly. And so for all of these reasons, I strongly urge a vote for the opposition team.
As the last speaker for the opposition team, I'll be going over voter issues, the reasons why you should give the ballot to the opposition team. But before that, I'd like to address some pressing issues that have been going back back and forth in today's debate regarding the United States economy primarily and why the United States federal government should either prioritize this type of plan or not prioritize such a plan. In fact, the government team claims that the opposition team is being unfair. One job equals another, which is why park rangers should be able to be comparable to a high-tech worker, like I mentioned in my first speech. But given the scope of the situation, like my partner just mentioned, we have to keep in mind the United States federal government cut 5% from the National Park Service budget for a reason. It was deemed non-essential, and this 5% cut was made enough so that they would be able to maintain all the current features that it has and not infringe on any of the park's obligations or services. And because of this, we have to realize that the government team's plan of just adding $400 million to an agency that doesn't need the money simply is a waste of budget allocation that could be better allocated to other parts of the departments to gain all the access and advantages that the government team proposes. So, going to my first voter issue today regarding significance, let's question the government team's plan once again. What problem are we actually solving for? Now, they bring up multiple issues regarding emergency services and all of these wildlife problems, which they listed out their advantages. But like my partner and I have continuously pointed out, this is extremely ambitious for a $400 million raise. In fact, if we put into perspective what $400 million actually constitutes the National Park Service, my partner did some mathematical analysis and calculated that this won't even run the National Park Service for more than one day, given its obligation and scope of 59 different national parks. It's clear that what the government team's plan is doing, although it does have good intentions and overstretches to all the types of obligations that the National Park Service does conduct, it's not going to be effective. It isn't actually going to be solving anything. So, holistically, let's take a step back and reanalyze the budget of the National Park Service. Currently, as I mentioned in my first speech, it has a budget of $2.9 billion after the 5% cut that the government team mentioned. My partner pointed out some flaws, reasoning that the government team believes that there were 40% park rangers that lost their jobs and a 60% cut in operations. This doesn't actually add up to the 5% cuts that were made, as the United States federal government made it so that they would be able to maintain all of their maintenance features and be able to run all of their operations. But furthermore, like I mentioned in my first speech, after this $2.9 billion budget that fulfills all of their services, they continue to have a $27.41 million revenue. This means that it's excess that they can use to patch up any other holes. Essentially, what the government team's plan is doing is adding $400 million to this $27.41 million excess. And what's it going to do? Just sit there unless the National Park Service has some way to put it into the budget. And we have argued continuously as an opposition team that it simply doesn't, and this $400 million that they're trying to pull from the defense budget could simply be put into other sectors of the United States federal government to garner their benefits even better, which directly translates to my second and final voter issue regarding solvency. Now, going back to our contention regarding opportunity cost, it's important to understand that the government team's plan of taking this $400 million and trying to run through all of their advantages, modernization, trying to improve the health of the American people, generate jobs and improve biodiversity, are all responsibilities that are not unique to the National Park Service and can be covered by other departments, probably even more efficiently. The Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, they all have obligations to address these other social welfare issues that are not unique to the National Park Service, and in fact, it's arguably reasonably to believe that they will do the job better, as the National Park Service does have other obligations, not just to address these issues that the government team proposes. But furthermore, they claim that this $400 million would be able to solve for all these problems, and unfortunately, that simply isn't true. If the pressing issues, if the issues that they mentioned are so pressing, my partner and I have shown you today that $400 million spread so thinly across the entire nation to cover all 59 of these national parks is not enough to make a huge impact. Rather, we can focus this $400 million to a specific sector of a different department in order to ensure that this type of problem will be solved. And the government team's plan is not the way to do so. And finally, let's take a step back and do some impact calculus and understand how this round has actually played out and what both sides have garnered. Now, the government team proposes an ambitious plan of $400 million to improve the efficiency of the entire National Park Service, but we've proven to you logically and shown you concrete examples of the United States federal government's reasoning as to the 5% cut and the effects that it has on maintenance to show that the government team's plan isn't actually going to be changing the situation. In fact, it's just going to be adding access to this and not solving for any pressing issues. And as for the opposition team, we've shown you that it's essential that these $400 million go to other sectors to improve this current situation, which is what these essential programs that the United States federal government did not cut from. And this is, because of all these reasons, I strongly urge the opposition team to vote.
partner ready? Are my opponents ready? Is the judge ready? Okay, before starting time, I want to offer everybody a statement of thanks for making this debate awesome. With that, let's hop right in. So first I'm going to be going over some talking points and then some voters on why the government team has won today's debate. First talking point is one of significance. Now, they question our statistic about 40% layoffs. Now, Judge, let me provide, since they brought this up in their third speech and we haven't had a chance to talk about it, let's talk about it right now. Judge, the reason that these 40% of people have been laid off is simply because when hit by immediate cuts by the budget, the easiest way to save money for national parks is through laying people off. That's the only reason the manpower has taken the 40% hit and not infrastructure and nothing and not other sources. So this is why the 40% statistic still makes sense. So let's talk about significance. A big point in this debate is that 15% increase in the NPS budget is not significant. Now, Judge, if a 5% hit not only resulted in 40% of rangers being laid off, but also a hit in the endangered species, then how is it reasonable to assume that 15% is not going to make a difference? In fact, they said there were 56 parks. Judge, if we divide it out, that's almost $2 million per park. Judge, how many salaries can that pay? How much food can it put on starving people's tables to do that? Also, there has been no counter statistics, no real clash on the statistics. So we can only assume that this 5%, since it was that significant, a 15% increase is going to be even more significant, specifically 3 times as significant. Now let's talk about the NPS needs. They say there's no need for the NPS to get this money, but we've given you specific safety examples. For example, the PCT trail, 50 miles spread apart, the rangers that have been hit, and in fact the Hawaii park where people are going on unsafe trails. The NPS needs this money. Now let's talk about the Grand Canyon example. The Grand Canyon example was brought up as a way to say that this money is a drop in the bucket. Sure, this money is not going to run the entire NPS, however, it serves as a supplement. Now, Judge, it takes, what, $1.7 billion to run the Grand Canyon for a week. However, $1.7 billion with a $2 million increase means that the Grand Canyon system is going to be that much more efficient, that much more fun for its members, and that much more safe for the people who go to the Grand Canyon. This supplement simply just helps save people's lives. So now let's bring on to some voters. Now, the most important thing to establish in this voters is that, Judge, you have to judge this round on whether the plan is better than the status quo. So the status quo right now is that all these money is going to the M1 tank production. And the status quo, and our plan is essentially just pouring this into the NPS. So now let's talk about voters. Our first voter is one of jobs. Now, there's 40% of people that were laid off this year with a specific ranger skill set. These people are out there struggling to feed their families because of this 5% cut. Now, with a 15% increase, not only will this 40% of people with ranger skills be rehired, but we're gonna be able to hire more people. We're gonna keep the people with the ranger skills and give them more jobs, which gets back to the economy and helps the poverty rate in America. Now, our second voter is one of necessity. Now, we've proven to you by 3 specific examples why the current system is unsafe, with the spread out, with the lack of rangers, and with the Hawaii example of erosion. Now, through this, we're going to help all these areas. So it is, in fact, a necessary spending. It's better the money goes towards the park services than the tanks, because by improving the park services, we directly save lives, Judge. So, in fact, that goes into our next voter, one of species and biodiversity. Now, Judge, with the 5% cut, both the grizzly bear population and the eagle population has taken a dive. We established that in the first speech, and with a 15% increase, it's only reasonable to assume that we're going to be able to protect these species better. In fact, we're going to protect these species 3 times better, Judge. And now our last voter is one of safety. That people attending these parks have a reasonable right to safety on these parks. Now, with the increase in emergency services, we're going to keep these people more safe. Now, to wrap up this speech, I want to compare the world with the plan and the world without the plan. Essentially, the plan versus the status quo. Currently, we are building tanks that we have no need for. However, with the plan, not only do we save lives of people in in national parks, but we're also creating multitudes of jobs. We're also saving species. We're keeping species from becoming extinct. Also, there's no harm to the plan. There's no harm brought up whatsoever. Why won't we do this, Judge? There is no reason. And for this reason, I urge a strong vote on the government side for this ballot. Thank you.
Thank you guys for judging. Sorry.
Do you guys have any, oral critique to offer, just on like speaking style or argumentation?
What I would suggest is, you guys did a very good job. I have no opinion on this, so every time I heard one of you speak, I would go this side and I would seesaw. That's how I am. So I've got to get all my thoughts together. So I'd like to spend the next 5 minutes getting my thoughts together because it's important for us to think about what we've got. And then I don't mind giving critiques or whatever a little later, but I like to just focus and get my thoughts together. Because you guys kind of got me going up and down. So
is it cool if we wait outside then to hear the critiques?
absolutely.
Actually, I would have one suggestion, right? I saw you guys chatting among yourselves. I want to, down the line, right, maybe keep that volume down a bit.
Alright. Thank you. We'll be outside.